The world knew Lou Reed as rock's rebel poet, but in 1973 his real battle wasn't with record executives or music critics. It was with a needle, a leather belt tourniquet, and the demon that lived inside every dose of heroin he pushed into his veins. What the audience at Max's Kansas City didn't know that November night was that the trembling in his hands wasn't stage nervousness. It was withdrawal. And what happened next would become one of rock history's most disturbing open secrets. The spotlight hit Lou Reed's pale face as he walked onto the stage, his trademark dark sunglasses hiding eyes that hadn't seen real sleep in 72 hours. His leather jacket hung loose on a frame that had lost 20 pounds in 3 months. The crowd erupted in applause, but Reed barely registered it. His mind was calculating something else entirely. How many hours since his last fix? How many hours until he could get another? And whether he could make it through the set without collapsing. This wasn't the triumphant return of the Transformer album's creator. This was a man dancing on the edge of oblivion, and everyone in that room was about to witness just how close to the edge he really was. Before we dive deeper into this haunting chapter of Lou Reed's life, if you want to explore more untold stories from rock's darkest corridors, subscribe to this channel. The secrets we uncover might change everything you thought you knew about your musical heroes. Lou Reed's relationship with heroin didn't begin with rock star excess or backstage parties. It started in 1964 in a cramped apartment on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, when a fellow musician offered him what seemed like a creative breakthrough. Reed was 22 years old, struggling to write songs that captured the gritty reality of New York's underground scene, and someone told him that heroin would open doors in his mind that straight consciousness kept locked. What they didn't tell him was that those doors, once opened, could never fully close again. The first time Reed injected heroin, he described it years later to a close friend as feeling like every anxiety, every fear, every painful memory from his electroshock therapy. Years simply dissolved into warm amber light. For someone who had spent his teenage years being tortured with electricity because his parents thought his sexuality was a disease, that feeling of total peace was more addictive than the drug itself. The Velvet Underground years coincided with Reed's descent into serious addiction, though most fans had no idea what was happening behind the scenes. While Andy Warhol was promoting the band as his latest art project, and Nico was captivating audiences with her icy European mystique, Reed was developing a habit that cost him more than just money. It cost him relationships, his health, and nearly his life on multiple occasions. Sterling Morrison, the band's rhythm guitarist, later recalled finding Reed passed out in dressing rooms with a needle still hanging from his arm. John Cale witnessed Reed's personality transform from the sharp, witty lyricist he'd co-founded the band with into someone unpredictable and volatile. The heroin wasn't just fueling Reed's artistic vision anymore. It was consuming him, and everyone around him could see it except Reed himself, who convinced himself that the drug was essential to his creative process. Nico's arrival in the Velvet Underground created a toxic dynamic that accelerated Reed's addiction spiral. She was using heroin too, and their relationship became a twisted dance of mutual destruction. They would shoot up together before performances, creating an intimacy born from shared self-destruction rather than genuine connection. Nico later told an interviewer that she and Lou had an unspoken understanding. They never tried to save each other because they both knew they didn't want to be saved. They wanted to sink deeper into the warm oblivion that heroin promised, and they wanted company while they did it. Reed wrote some of his most hauntingly beautiful songs during this period, including Heroin itself, a 6-minute meditation on addiction that alternated between the rush of the high and the crushing despair of reality. But the song wasn't a warning. It was a love letter to the drug that was slowly killing him. The recording sessions for the Velvet Underground's albums became increasingly chaotic as Reed's addiction worsened. He would nod off mid-take, forcing the band to stop and wait for him to regain focus. His guitar playing, once precise and inventive, became sloppy and unfocused. Warhol, who prided himself on documenting reality without judgment, grew concerned enough to pull Sterling Morrison aside one day and ask if Reed was going to survive the year. Morrison didn't have an answer. Nobody did. Reed was living on borrowed time, and the heroin had become so central to his existence that the idea of quitting seemed impossible. He needed it to sleep, to wake up, to perform, to write, to simply exist. The drug that had once promised liberation had become the cruelest prison imaginable. When Reed left the Velvet Underground in 1970, many assumed it was about artistic differences or ego clashes with John Cale. But people close to Reed knew the truth. He was trying to escape the scene that enabled his addiction. He moved back to his parents' house in Long Island, a humiliating retreat for a 28-year-old rock musician, and took a job as a typist for his father's accounting firm. For 9 months, Lou Reed, the man who had written I'm Waiting for the Man and White Light, White Heat, lived a suburban nightmare, commuting to an office job and living under his parents' disappointed gaze. But he was clean. For those 9 months, Reed didn't touch heroin, and his body slowly began to remember what sobriety felt like. His hands stopped shaking. His appetite returned. The constant paranoia and anxiety that came with addiction began to fade. He even started writing new songs, softer and more introspective than his Velvet Underground work. The illusion of recovery shattered when David Bowie entered Reed's life in 1971. Bowie was fascinated by Reed's underground legend and wanted to produce his next album. The opportunity was too good to refuse, and Reed found himself back in London, surrounded by the music industry's glittering chaos. Within 2 weeks of arriving in England, Reed was using again. Bowie later claimed he had no idea about the extent of Reed's addiction during the Transformer sessions, but others who were there tell a different story. They remember Reed disappearing for hours between takes, returning with pinpoint pupils and a distant expression. They remember Bowie's increasing frustration as Reed's performance became unreliable. They remember the moment when Bowie walked in on Reed preparing a shot in the studio bathroom and simply closed the door without saying a word. The Transformer album became a massive success, making Reed a genuine rock star. But the price of that success was a relapse that would consume the next 5 years of his life. The 1973-1976 period marked the darkest chapter of Reed's addiction, when the line between his public persona and private desperation disappeared entirely. This was when the rumors started circulating among music journalists and industry insiders. Lou Reed was using heroin on stage. Not before shows, not after shows, but during them. The stories seemed too outrageous to be true, the kind of rock mythology that grows from a kernel of truth into full-blown legend. But multiple witnesses confirmed that on at least 3 separate occasions, Reed openly displayed track marks during performances, made jokes about needing a fix, and once even pantomimed injecting himself between songs while the audience laughed nervously, unsure if they were watching performance art or genuine desperation. At a concert in Detroit in November 1973, Reed's addiction reached a new low that few who were there ever forgot. He stumbled onto the stage 40 minutes late, his pupils so constricted they looked like pinpoints in his pale face. His first attempt to play his guitar produced nothing but discordant noise because his fingers couldn't find the frets properly. The audience, initially excited, grew restless and concerned. Reed attempted to sing "Vicious," but forgot the lyrics halfway through the first verse. He stopped, looked at the audience with an expression that seemed to contain both defiance and despair, and said into the microphone, "You know what I need right now? I need to get well." The crowd's uncomfortable laughter echoed through the venue as Reed's band members exchanged worried glances. The performance eventually continued, but it was a train wreck of missed cues, forgotten lyrics, and Reed's barely contained physical agony as withdrawal symptoms began creeping in. What most people don't understand about heroin addiction is that it creates two states of being, using and withdrawing. There is no neutral ground. By 1974, Reed needed heroin every 4 to 6 hours just to feel normal, let alone to perform. His tour manager during this period, a man named Dennis Katz, later described the elaborate systems they developed to ensure Reed could maintain his habit while touring. They would research drug connections in every city before arrival. They would schedule performance times around Reed's dosing schedule. They would keep emergency supplies hidden in instrument cases in case their regular supply dried up. The entire touring operation revolved around keeping Lou Reed supplied with heroin, because everyone knew that without it, there would be no show at all. The most disturbing incident occurred at a small club in Amsterdam in March 1975. Reed arrived at the venue already high, his movements slow and his speech slurred. He performed the first 3 songs in a near catatonic state, barely moving on stage. Then, during an extended guitar solo, witnesses say he walked to the side of the stage, rolled up his sleeve, and openly examined his arms for viable injection sites. The house lights were low enough that most of the audience couldn't see clearly what he was doing, but the people in the front rows were close enough to see the needle tracks, the bruises, the evidence of countless injections mapped across his pale skin. Reed then returned to the microphone and continued the show as if nothing had happened. A music journalist who was there that night wrote in his unpublished notes that watching Lou Reed perform that evening felt like witnessing a slow-motion suicide, and everyone in the room was somehow complicit in it by simply watching and doing nothing. As Reed's addiction deepened, his circle of friends and collaborators shrank to only those who enabled his drug use or those too afraid to confront him about it. David Bowie, who had briefly tried to encourage Reed to seek help, eventually gave up and stopped returning Reed's phone calls. John Cale refused to work with him again, telling a mutual friend that watching Lou destroy himself was too painful. Rachel, Reed's transgender partner during this period, was one of the few people who stayed, but their relationship was complicated by the fact that Rachel was also using heroin. They created a codependent bubble where their shared addiction was the foundation of their bond. Rachel later described those years as a time when she and Lou existed in a separate reality from the rest of the world. A reality where nothing mattered except the next fix and the brief windows of peace it provided. Reed's creative output during this period reflected his deteriorating condition. The 1975 album Metal Machine Music, which consisted entirely of guitar feedback and electronic noise with no songs or lyrics, was widely interpreted as either an avant-garde artistic statement or a deliberate insult to his record label. But people close to Reed suggest a darker truth. He was so consumed by addiction that he had temporarily lost the ability to write coherent songs. The album was 64 minutes of processed sound because that was all Reed's heroin-soaked brain could produce. It wasn't rebellion or experimentation. It was the sound of a man's creative faculties shutting down under the weight of chemical dependency. Record stores received hundreds of returns. Critics savaged it. Reed's record label considered dropping him entirely. But Reed seemed almost pleased by the chaos he'd created, as if destroying his commercial viability was somehow preferable to admitting he needed help. By 1976, the physical consequences of Reed's addiction were becoming impossible to hide. He weighed barely 130 pounds on his 5'8" frame. His skin had taken on a grayish pallor that makeup couldn't fully conceal. His veins were so damaged from repeated injections that finding a viable site for a fix became increasingly difficult. He began injecting between his toes, in his groin, anywhere he could still find a vein that hadn't collapsed. A doctor who examined Reed during this period later wrote in confidential notes that he was surprised Reed was still alive, given the level of organ damage his tests revealed. Reed's liver was showing signs of serious disease. His heart rhythm was irregular. His immune system was so compromised that a simple infection could potentially kill him. The lowest point came during a 1976 tour stop in Cleveland, when Reed collapsed backstage after a performance. His heart had stopped for nearly 40 seconds before paramedics managed to revive him. The official story released to the press was that Reed had suffered from exhaustion and dehydration. The truth was that he had overdosed, taking too much heroin too quickly in an attempt to achieve the high that his tolerance now made almost impossible to reach. When Reed regained consciousness in the hospital, his first words to his tour manager were not expressions of gratitude for being saved or promises to get clean. They were instructions on where to find his backup drug supply so he wouldn't go into withdrawal while hospitalized. Even a brush with death wasn't enough to break the addiction's grip. Several people in Reed's life attempted interventions during these years, but all of them failed. His former bandmate Sterling Morrison flew to New York specifically to confront Reed about his drug use, showing up at Reed's apartment with a plan to convince him to enter rehab. Reed listened politely for about 5 minutes before asking Morrison to leave and never bring up the subject again. Rachel tried multiple times to convince Reed that they should get clean together. But every attempt lasted only a few days before one or both of them would relapse. Reed's parents, who had subjected him to electroshock therapy as a teenager, were the last people Reed would listen to about his life choices. He actively avoided contact with them, and when forced to interact at family events, he would show up obviously high, almost daring them to comment on his condition. What made Reed's addiction particularly difficult to address was his intelligence and self-awareness. He knew exactly what heroin was doing to him. He understood the medical consequences, the career damage, the relationship destruction. He could articulate all of it clearly when asked, but knowing and changing were two different things. Reed once told a journalist in a rare moment of honesty that heroin had saved his life after the trauma of electroshock therapy, that it had given him the emotional numbness he needed to survive. The fact that it was now killing him seemed almost irrelevant compared to the peace it had once provided. This wasn't ignorance or denial. This was a conscious choice to value the temporary relief heroin offered over his long-term survival, and that made it almost impossible for anyone to intervene successfully. One of the most disturbing aspects of Reed's addiction years was how it complicated his artistic legacy. Songs like Heroin, I'm Waiting for the Man, and White Light, White Heat were considered masterpieces of rock songwriting, capturing the reality of drug culture with unflinching honesty. But were these songs warnings about addiction's dangers, or were they romanticizing a lifestyle that was literally killing their creator? Music critics praised Reed for his willingness to write about subjects other songwriters avoided, calling him brave and authentic. But fans who looked closely could see that Reed wasn't writing about heroin from a distance. He was writing love letters to his own addiction, and every word was soaked in the complicated truth that he both loved and hated the drug that dominated his life. The irony wasn't lost on Reed himself. In a rare interview from 1977, when he was briefly attempting sobriety, he admitted that his heroin songs had probably influenced countless young fans to experiment with drugs, seeing Reed's addiction as somehow glamorous or artistically necessary. He expressed something approaching regret about this, but then qualified it by saying that he'd only written his truth, and people were responsible for their own choices. This moral ambiguity characterized Reed's entire relationship with his addiction narrative. He refused to apologize for his art, but he also seemed dimly aware that his public persona as a functional addict was a lie that his private suffering contradicted. Medical professionals who have studied Reed's case in retrospect expressed genuine amazement that he survived his addiction years. The combination of his pre-existing health issues from electroshock therapy, the duration and intensity of his heroin use, and the numerous overdoses and near-death experiences should have killed him. Some doctors suggest that Reed's survival was simply luck, that he happened to have a constitution that could withstand abuse, that would have killed most people. Others point to the periods of forced sobriety when Reed was hospitalized or when his drug supply was interrupted as crucial recovery windows that allowed his body to partially heal before the next relapse. But perhaps the most compelling explanation comes from Reed himself in one of his later interviews. He suggested that his survival instinct, damaged as it was, never completely disappeared. Even in his darkest moments, some part of him wanted to live, wanted to create music, wanted to experience something beyond the narrow world that heroin had created for him. That small spark of self-preservation, combined with the intervention of friends who kept him from completely isolating himself, and the luck of being wealthy enough to afford relatively pure drugs and medical care when he needed it, somehow added up to survival. It wasn't a clean narrative of redemption or recovery. It was a messy, painful, barely achieved survival that left scars Reed would carry for the rest of his life. The beginning of Reed's slow climb out of addiction came not from a dramatic intervention or near-death experience, but from simple exhaustion. By 1978, Reed later admitted he was tired of the constant need to score drugs, tired of the physical pain, tired of the isolation and paranoia that addiction created, tired of watching people in his life give up on him. This exhaustion created a small opening for change, and a new relationship helped push him through that opening. Sylvia Morales, whom Reed met in 1978, wasn't part of the music scene and had no patience for drug use. She made it clear that a relationship with her required sobriety, and for reasons Reed himself couldn't fully articulate. He wanted that relationship more than he wanted heroin. The process of getting clean wasn't cinematic or inspiring. It was brutal, ugly, and filled with relapses. Reed would be sober for weeks, then use again. He would promise Sylvia and himself that this time was different, then break that promise. But slowly, the periods of sobriety grew longer, and the relapses became less frequent. Reed sought medical help, attending methadone clinics and working with addiction counselors, though he rarely spoke about these efforts publicly. He wanted to preserve his image as someone who had conquered addiction through willpower alone, even though the reality was much more complicated and involved significant medical and psychological support. By 1980, Reed had achieved something resembling stable sobriety, though he would struggle with occasional relapses throughout the decade. The physical damage from his addiction years was permanent. His liver remained compromised for the rest of his life, eventually contributing to the organ failure that killed him in 2013. The needle tracks and collapsed veins were constant reminders of the years he'd lost to heroin. But Reed managed to rebuild his career, creating some of his most critically acclaimed work in the decades following his addiction peak. Albums like New York and Magic and Loss showed a mature, reflective artist who had survived his demons. Reed rarely spoke in detail about his addiction years in later interviews, preferring to focus on his current work. When pressed, he would acknowledge the drug use but resist any narrative that framed him as either victim or hero. He had made choices, he said, and he had survived those choices. This reticence left fans and journalists filling in the gaps with speculation, turning Reed's addiction into a legend that simplified the brutal reality of those years. As Reed faced his mortality in 2013, dying from complications related to his damaged liver, those closest to him report that he finally expressed regret about his addiction years. Not regret about the music he'd created, but regret about the pain he'd caused people who loved him and the decades spent either using or recovering. Laurie Anderson, his wife during his final years, described Reed as someone who had made peace with his past, but never forgot the cost of his choices. Lou Reed's story isn't a cautionary tale with a clear moral. It's the complicated truth of a brilliant artist who used drugs to cope with trauma, became addicted, nearly destroyed himself, and survived to create meaningful work for decades afterward. The stage injection scandal and the years of public addiction weren't performance art. They were the visible evidence of a man drowning in plain sight while audiences applauded.